All right, welcome back. So we're moving on from the Rachel's text and exploring in the last weeks of this course a related subject, distributive justice, right? So it's a bit more of an applied ethical problem. What is the moral way, the right way to distribute goods in a society, right? Is everyone entitled to just whatever they can get? Um, be some sort of taxation system for, public goods like freeways and things like that, right? Certainly I can't afford to build a freeway on my own, right? So maybe it makes sense to pool a portion of my income with everybody else through a taxation system so that freeway is available for everyone. Um, you can imagine there's a wide spectrum, right, on how much should be distributed or how little. And so we're going to explore three different authors who have different perspectives on this approach, and even different perspectives on what counts as a good, right? Or how we should we think of it just in terms of money or in terms of something else. So we'll start with Nozick, who's sort of on the conservative, I'd say, kind of libertarian end of the spectrum, um, which many of you may not be your default political inclination, but the reason I cover Nozick is because his arguments are fairly convincing, right? So it's a good place to start. If you think that there should be, taxation to help people in need, you have to contend with Nozick's arguments and figure out how you can justify that, because he does a good job of arguing against it. So any society is going to involve the sharing of goods, right? Any society of any adequate size, or really even a small one, right? I mean, as I'm the example I used, right? It's impractical to build your own freeway, right, to get from one end of Los Angeles to the other, and to not allow anyone else on it. It's just like no one can afford it, and it's very impractical, right, to have one road that only for one person. Um, you just don't use it enough to justify that kind of expense. So it makes sense that you'd want to get together with other members of your society and agree, okay, we'll all pitch in, and we'll all use this road. And everyone is going to make out better on that deal. You can spend less money on it, and just use it when you need to. It's not just freeways and public works. There are other ways that we might want to sort of pool our resources. So you might want to have some form of insurance against bad luck, right? So suppose that you work in construction or something where you need to be physically able to walk around and do certain things, and suppose you're injured and you can no longer do that occupation. It would be nice to know that even if you had some bad luck and were injured, you wouldn't starve to death and lose your home, right? So maybe uh, you'd want to maybe you would agree like freely to say, hey, let's everyone pool in a certain percentage of our income every year, so that maybe I'm lucky and I never have to use the insurance, right? But maybe if I'm unlucky, then I'll have that some of that money will come back to me, right? Um, what counts as bad luck is sort of open to interpretation, right? So injury certainly seems like bad luck. Some people might think bad luck includes just being born poor, right? Some people are born more well off than others. And so you could envision an insurance scheme for that. We'll set up society such that if people have the bad luck of being born poor, they'll get some extra funds from everyone else's taxes to help them get a leg up, right? And so on. Or becoming poor, right? So typically, taxation is the way we operate these sorts of schemes. It's doesn't have to be the only one. You could get together with you know, 1,000 of your friends and decide to all chip in for a freeway. But typically, we let the government handle those sorts of things, and the government taxes us in order to implement those various sorts of schemes for public works or insurance and so on. And so the question of which of these sorts of schemes is justified and which are not is the question of distributive justice. The answers to the question range from total free market capitalism, right? No taxation is allowed, to communism, right, where the state has complete control over the economy. Uh, we don't really, I don't really have time to cover Marx or like the fully communist side of the debate. Um, so what I end up doing is covering a range of opinions that are roughly reflect the mains, the major streams of thought in the United States right now, right? But in a longer class, it would be interesting to cover more extreme versions on, I guess, what we call that, right? So here we're going to begin. It's sort of I think the extreme that you find in the United States on I guess, the right, Robert Nozick, and he's going to argue for a very minimal redistribution. So Nozick, obviously, there are good, we're talking about distributing things that are valuable, and sometimes that comes in the form of money, but it might come in the form of other things, say, land, stocks, bonds, um, labor, uh, art. So he just calls it all holdings, right? Whatever you have of some value, right, and whatever might be distributed, we'll call it a holding. So the question is, what justifies you in having the holdings you have? When is a distribution of holdings a just one, right? Where, okay, Nate has these things, right, and someone else has these things, and so on. We'd like a picture, right, where that distribution is a just one. That is the question we're asking here. So according to Nozick, we can find out if a distribution is a just one based on three factors. First, we'd like to know whether the holdings acquired were acquired justly, right? Um, there's three ways that holdings can come to be acquired, right? Um, Original acquisition, right? So that means it's hard to imagine this now, but once upon a time there were things that were not owned, right? There were areas of land that no one had claimed, right? There were trees and rocks and other, silver mines, right, that hadn't been exploited, or no one had taken a claim on them, right? So there is some process whereby something that is not owned becomes owned, right? Um, Things haven't been owned since the beginning of time. And if you want to find out whether someone's current holdings are owned justly, you would have to start to trace it back, right? Because there has to be justice all the way down the line, back to whenever the first human being decided, I own that tree or that piece of land. So what is the process whereby, right, something that is not owned can justly become owned? Um, that's sort of the trickiest part, I think, right? We'll spend more time at the end of the lecture on hashing out how that is possible, right? And John Locke, a philosopher from the 1800s, has an account of how that could work. Um, Once something has become owned, from there on out, right, it tends to be transferred from person to person. Pretty much everything you own uh, has been transferred to you, right? Meaning, you bought it or someone voluntarily gave it to you. Uh, so the second part of deciding whether your holdings are just, whether a distribution is just, is whether the things that were transferred justly. An unjust transfer of holdings would be theft, right? If someone steals your bike, well, they come to be in possession of that bike, but not justly, right? That's an unjust. And then third, given that part one and part two might occasionally fail, as in the case of someone stealing your bike, we then need uh, a process for rectification of unjust transfers. So if somebody steals your bike, what do we do about it? How do we, right, fix that injustice? So Nozick has some accounts, mainly of one and two, right? Three is sort of intuitive. We have a justice system that works. So, given those concepts, right, of like, okay, you go back to the beginning of time, nothing was owned, and then things became owned, and then for centuries and centuries, people transferred things around, right? Sometimes justly, sometimes unjustly, by selling and giving away and stealing. Um, we can paint a picture of what it would look like for a distribution to be just. A distribution of holdings is just if and only if everyone who originally acquired something did it the right way, right? And we have to get into the details of what the right way of getting something that wasn't owned before is. Second, if you got something via a transfer, um, you'll have to have acquired that justly, right? So, you know, either buying it or being gifted it. And then three, um, one and two are the only way you're entitled to a holding. If you got something and you didn't either acquire it originally, right, where it wasn't owned and you came to own it, or two, you got it transferred to you justly, then you are not entitled to it. So, given those three steps, right, and that's the account of knowing whether everything, all of your holdings are justly, are just, right, uh, then we can say a theory of distributive justice, right, is that everyone, as long as everyone is entitled to their holdings according to those three steps, then the distribution is just, right? So this is a very particular type of account, right? Other theories are not going to look like this. It's what he calls a historical account, right? So when we want to know, hey, is right, for example, the United States right now, right? Some people are billionaires, some people are very, very poor. Everybody has various amounts of holdings, right? And if we want to ask ourselves, well, is this a just distribution, right? Um, Many people, their default wouldn't necessarily be to look at uh, history, right, and see, well, were those holdings acquired justly? Instead, many people would say, geez, it's not fair, right, for some people to have billions of dollars and some people to have nothing. I just look at the pattern here and it looks to me to be unjust. That is not Nozick's approach, right? He says you can't look at any particular pattern of distribution and know whether it's just or unjust. You have to look at the history of it and see how those holdings were acquired. Um, so it depends on the actual history of the flow of those goods through the various owners, right? Um, Now, uh, well, we'll see that, right? This will start to sound pretty conservative, right? Um, it sounds like if I made my money fair and square, right? Suppose I'm a billionaire and I just whatever I developed a vaccine, right? And I charged people an outrageous amount for it, and they paid up because they really wanted that vaccine, right, to save their lives. And I became very, very rich. Nozick would say, "Well, okay, you're entitled to that, right? You got it fair and square." Um, but there are some aspects of Nozick's account that are pretty that are not so conservative, particularly the idea of uh, step three, the rectification of unjust holdings, right? So, for example, if you think that any of the land here in the United States was unjustly acquired from the Native Americans at any point, um, the Nozick would say you have to give that back, right? It's unjust. So um, that would look pretty radical, right? If you took, I don't know, New York, the state of New York, and gave it back um, to the Native Americans that originally settled that land, that would be pretty radical, right? But so he's an interesting mix of very conservative on one hand, but in some ways very radical. Right? So Nozick's account is this historical account, right? He's looking at the history. Says, is this a just distribution? Well, let's see how everybody got their stuff. Did they get it fair and square? Okay, then it's a just distribution, right? But you can contrast that with what we call end result accounts of distributed justice, right? Um, for example, think about how a utilitarian would think about the right way to distribute holdings, right? Well, they would want a distribution that maximized pleasure, right? So they would be looking at the result. They would say, okay, who has what? And maybe they'd say, okay, this, this billionaire, um, the first $1 million made them really happy. And then after that, it's sort of diminishing returns, right? The difference for a billionaire between having whatever, $100 million and $101 million, just it doesn't make much difference to them. So a utilitarian might say, hey, let's take that $1 million and give it to some people who are starving, right? Think of how much more pleasure we could generate for them, right? To have an extra $100 or $1,000, huge deal, right? Would make them very, very happy. Whereas the billionaire, an extra $1 million, they hardly even notice it, right? So utilitarian approach would look at the end result. How can we generate the most pleasure? They wouldn't be so concerned with the past. And we've seen this with utilitarianism in general. It's forward looking, right? They think about consequences. So that's just to distinguish Nozick's historical account with, some other approaches that you might have. Uh, and it doesn't have to be pleasure. There's lots of different, sorts of results that you might be looking for. You might be looking for a certain amount of happiness and freedom, right? A certain amount of equality. Um, Depending on what your value is that you want to distribute it in a certain way, you can have a different sort of end result, but it's not going to be Nozick's account. Oh, another point, the last point on that last slide was um, it's not going to matter who's rich and who's poor. If you're a utilitarian, right, and it seems to you that okay, it turns out that the happiness maximizing situation will work out so long as uh, person A has $500,000 and person B has like 1,000 for whatever reason, right? Well, probably according to the utilitarian, it wouldn't matter if those amounts were switched and person B had right the 500,000 and person A had the 1,000. It's the pattern, the overall pattern of happiness that matters. It's not going to necessarily matter who has what and how they came to get it, right? Fair and square is not a concern for utilitarians, right? It's overall pleasure, right? Nozick, it's all about the history of who has what, right? It's very person specific, and did you get it fair? So Nozick's enemies are these end result theorists, right? He's a historical account, and so he's going to try to sort of tear down the appeal of looking at the end result. And he thinks that no one, this aspect of the end result theories, where which person is which doesn't really matter so much. He thinks that's nobody's going to accept that really, right? So, for example, um, if a murder is committed, nobody thinks that so long as somebody goes to prison, justice has been served, right? No, we would say no. It has to be the person that did the murder that goes to jail, right? The history matters there. It's right? We want to know, we want to look back and say, okay, who did the killing, right? We don't just say, okay, as long as someone's punished, right? Um, and he thinks even, socialists, right, who do tend to be on the left side of the spectrum with more redistribution of earnings, they still, in their philosophy, think that the redistribution to the workers is justified because the workers created the value, right? So they also are focused on the history. They think the person that created the value by performing the work, they're the one that's entitled to the holdings. So there's still a sense of entitlement to as related to the past. So there's a sort of a complicated, I don't think it's super important to keep track of all these threads here, right? So we've got historical account, we've got end result account, and then we've got what he called pattern theories. So pattern theories are not all end result, but they kind of tend to be, right? So if in your mind it helps you to think of end result theories and pattern theories as more or less the same thing and as both distinct and opposed to Nozick historical account, I think that will be fine, right? So um, a pattern theory, right, says I don't really care how people got what they got, right? I want to look at society and see a certain distribution of resources that matches a certain pattern, and that's what I call justice, right? So there's lots of different ways you could do that. You could do it in a utilitarian way and say, I want the pattern that generates the most pleasure, right? You could do that. Or you might say, I want a pattern that rewards the most ethical people, right? And so the most resources should be distributed to those with of the best moral character who have done the best things, and then people that are the most immoral will get the least distribution. You could do it according to anything. You could do it according to height if you wanted. It would be totally arbitrary if you say all the tallest people should get the most money and all the shortest people should get the least money, right? You could do it according to intelligence. Um, so a pattern theory um, varies along some natural dimension, whichever one you want to pick, be it happiness, right, morality, height. Um, and a pattern theory of justice is going to say, let's arrange, right? A just distribution is one that uh, awards, hands out holdings along that dimension. Um, there's lots of ones, right? The communism one is to each according to their needs, right? So if I need more money, right, then give me more money, right? If I don't need that much, then don't give me more. That's a pattern theory. According to merit, you can do it according to how hard you work, right? So the hardest worker, the person that puts in the most hours, right, they get the most money. Lots of ways you do it, but those are all patterns, right? They're all looking at an end result. And that way, they're very different from Nozick's account, who's looking at the history. Again, did you get your stuff fair and square? So, there is something appealing about a pattern theory of justice. Many of us have sort of assumed it, right? They want to look at the world and see, oh, no one's starving, right? That's kind of a pattern that people would broadly agree with, right? So they want to look at the world and say, okay, this feels like justice, right? There's not maybe too much inequality and things like that. Nozick's account, which is not patterned, will tend to produce a sort of a predictable pattern, right? Because um, people will tend to acquire and transfer properties for various reasons, right? So, if cars are very useful to people and lots of people transfer their holdings to Henry Ford or Elon Musk in order to get a car, uh, then it will look like a pattern is developing of like usefulness, right? More goods being distributed to those who produce useful things. Um, but it's not a pattern theory, right? It is, again, historical theory. Uh, so here's this is a famous example that Nozick uses to try to argue that pattern theories of justice can never work, right? He says, I, I don't know if any of you know Wilt Chamberlain. He was very famous sort of in the 70s as a great basketball player. Um, he says, let's imagine this situation, right? Let's suppose that you are a pattern theorist, right? And you have some idea of what um, perfect distribution would look like. Maybe you want to say, you know, very no more billionaires, right? And no one's starving, and everyone's, somehow like everyone is able to live comfortably, right? That's the pattern that you'd like to see. That's I think one that many people hold, right? Nozick says, well, sounds attractive, but he's going to argue that your pattern theory can never work. So he says, imagine you're in that world where your pattern has been achieved, right? We finally have justice, right? There's no more billionaires. Everybody can eat. We're happy at last. And then he says, now let's keep playing the tape and see what happens from there on out, right? He says, imagine that we still have basketball, right? And that Wilt Chamberlain uh, is an amazing basketball player and he attracts large audiences. People love to watch him play, right? And his contract is up for renewal. And so he negotiates a deal that says, look, um, I want an extra 25 cents from every ticket sold, right, at each home game. And that ticket is going to come out of the pockets of each attendee, right? There's going to be a separate box set up. And if you go buy a ticket to see the Harlem Globetrotters play, you're going to take an extra 25 cents and you're going to say, oh, this goes to Wilt Chamberlain, right? And let's say that many millions of people are happy to do that, right? They love watching him play. He's so good. 25 cents is a great deal. And so they walk up there, buy their ticket, and they're like, here, Wilt, here's your 25 cents. Can't wait to see you play, right? Well, what's going to happen? Wilt Chamberlain's going to end up making more than all the other players, right? Um, Nozick asks, is there any injustice in that, right? Should we take some of Wilt's extra money and redistribute it back to the other players? And Nozick says, well, no. How could that distribution be unjust? Each person said, I want this quarter to go to Wilt Chamberlain. This is my quarter, and I'm giving it to Wilt Chamberlain, right? Um, right. So they're not going to complain about it. The people who didn't drop the quarter can't complain, right? They could. That's up to them. If they don't want to give the money to Wilt Chamberlain, they don't have to, right? Um, and the other players, it's not like they lost money on the deal, right? They just didn't get as much as Wilt, right? People gave extra to Wilt. Um, you can imagine, suppose it's a total socialist society. Well, shouldn't Wilt be able to do a little extra work on the side to make more if he wants, right? What could be unjust about that? Claims Nozick. So the moral of this story, right, is that a pattern distribution, even if it happens and you have perfect justice, you can't maintain it without constantly interfering into people's lives, right? People are going to want to give their money, right? They're going to voluntarily exchange holdings, right? They're going to want to buy bikes on Craigslist. They're going to go see, you know, Taylor Swift and whatever else. Um, and so your pattern is going to get disrupted, right? Because people are voluntarily giving their money to other people in exchange for something. So you're going to have to keep coming back in and interfering, right? Um, and he says, how could that be just, right? If someone says, yes, please, I want to give my money to Taylor Swift, and the government comes in and says, actually, no, you can't. I have to give some of that money to Nate. Uh, Nozick says, where is the justice in that, right? Um, and he says the key thing, right, um, is that people concerned with pattern distributions, they worry about how much someone can get, right? How some people get too much money, people think, be redistributed, but they're not thinking about the fact that people voluntarily gave that money to those people, right? And they're also a pattern theorist is trying to limit how much people can voluntarily give, and he thinks that seems strange. He calls it individualism with a vengeance. You're not even allowed to give money to anybody, right, without the government coming in to prevent you. So he thinks that in addition to a right to, receive money from work, we're importantly have the right to give our money to whoever we want, right? If I want my quarter to go to Wilt Chamberlain, it should go to Wilt Chamberlain and not to someone else via, through the means. So with all that in the background, it makes sense why Nozick would then say taxation is essentially equivalent to forced labor, right? So if you work for $25 an hour and at the end of the week, the government takes $25 in taxes, they have taken an hour of your labor, right, and distributed it out to someone else. Um, maybe that $25 is given to the military or to roads in some other state, right, or someone, who needs assistance. But what they've done there is appropriated your labor as someone else's, right? Um, Now, if it wasn't in the form of money, right, but instead they kept it in the form of labor, which it essentially is, he said no one would accept that, right? That the government said, okay, you have to work an extra 5 hours a week for the poor, right? So it's Friday and it's 5 o'clock and you're ready to clock out. No, now you need to do your charity work, right? And it's forced by the government. Nozick says people would, right, be very upset about that. He says, well, that's what they're doing with taxation. They're just stealing hours of their labor. In fact, taxation is even weirder because you can avoid it altogether by just making sure you don't earn any money or very little money, right? Um, but isn't that sort of perverse, he argues? Why should you be punished for wanting to work more so you can have a little more, right? So that the system as it is, he thinks, seems to favor people who are easily satisfied with very few material goods, right? Um, so they work just enough to get what they need. Taxation doesn't kick in any significant way for them. Um, and so they get away without the government taking much from them. Um, and he says, well, why favor those folks? Why not reward people who want to work more, right, and earn more? So he thinks taxation gives other people part ownership. They're allowed to direct your labor to their own ends, make you work more to pay for what they want. Right? Now, maybe Nozick, the reason I teach this is I don't this isn't necessarily my approach. I don't think that this is the right approach, but he's very convincing, right? So the challenge is to figure out what's wrong with Nozick's approach. And I do like to remind you that um, the other part that is very sort of aggressive for him is rectifying past wrongs again. So if anything way back in history, right? If there was an injustice, you know, and the land that this university was on was unjustly acquired, or something like that, then although Nozick's approach seems very conservative as taxation goes, it's very um, extreme as rectification of right acquisition goes, and seems like we'd have to give the university or the land back to the original owner. So there's other, little problems, right? Theory of justice, a pattern theory, which again Nozick is trying to argue against, um, would seem also to entail that you can't ever move from one country to another, because that would be sort of the equivalent of tax dodging. Um, so we should go back to step one, right? Because it is the fuzziest. Like, how do unowned things come to be owned? So, if Nozick's account is going to work, we need a workable account of how unowned things come to be owned, and that seems like a very strange thing. Right? It's sort of lost history. Uh, so Nozick falls back on John Locke, who's a very famous philosopher from the 1700s, and John Locke does have an account of initial acquisition of holdings. Right? Um, Locke says some things about it. They're a little difficult to interpret, right? So he says things like, "We come to own a previously unowned object by, quote, mixing our labor with it." So what could that mean, to mix your labor with something, right? So suppose I travel to Mars where there's unowned land, and I go work a plot of land, an acre of land, and I grow some crops. So I've definitely expended some labor improving the land, fertilizing it so that it generates something of value, right? So is this what we mean by mixing my labor with the land? Um, Maybe, right? But what have I mixed my labor with? What do I now own, right? The whole planet Mars. I did mix my labor on some part of Mars. Just the particular plot of land that I actually actively worked. Uh, is it just the crops, right? Is it just the excess value that was created that I own? If I build a fence around a plot of land, do I own the land or just the fence? It's not clear, right? What am I mixing my labor with? The metaphor starts to strain. Um, and what is it about mixing uh, that creates ownership? Certainly, you own your own labor, but why is it when I mix it with something else, I now own the whole thing, right? Um, we don't typically take that to be the way things work, right? If I own a can of tomato juice and I pour it in the ocean, I'm mixing something I own with something I don't own. Do I come to own the ocean, or have I just wasted my tomato juice? Right? What is it about labor that I can mix it with something else and then come to own more, right, than just my labor? Maybe my labor has made the thing more valuable, and so I'm entitled to the added value, right? Um, Well, sometimes that's the case. Sometimes labor can make something less value. Here I have this right terrible mural of Kobe Bryant. Have I just added value to that wall by painting that mural, or have I right made it less valuable? So it's not obvious that mixing labor with something makes it more valuable. But let's suppose in some cases it increases. Well, does that mean I own the object, right? So the land, or do I just own the produce of the land? That was presumably what was added. Um, and there's the other issue of uh, so Locke has an additional sort of thing to say about the mixing of labor. He says you can own something that's not owned by mixing your labor with it, but only if you leave enough and is good left for everyone else, right? So I can't just um, come in and just try to mix my labor with everything as fast as possible, right? With the as much land as possible, and just take it all so there's nothing left for anyone else, right? Um, and that seems reasonable, but the problem with that is that it doesn't seem tenable because eventually there won't be enough left for everyone. Right? So if I take a little plot of land, I make that mine. Someone comes along, okay, they can't take mine, so they have to take another one, another one, another one. Eventually, all the land's used up, right? So does that mean that the last person to take a plot of land was not entitled to it because they didn't leave enough for everybody else? And if that's the case, then the person before that person also didn't leave enough for everybody else, right? And the person before that, and before that, and before that, and before you know it, no one's entitled to acquire anything, right? You want to add this proviso that you leave enough for everyone else, it's going to sort of collapse back on you, arguably, and make it that no one can ever acquire anything, right? So that's this whole slide here, right? So uh, suppose that person Z can't acquire, right? There's only one patch of land left. and person Z can't get that land without leaving enough for others because it's the last one, right? Um, that would seem that it left that Y's acquisition of the land left Z worse off because now Z can't acquire that last bit. And that means X's acquisition left Y worse off, right? And so on backwards until no one can acquire any land. Um, this worry might be balanced out by the overall positive results of a system of property rights. So you might say, well, look, everyone's better off if some people own some land, right? So we can't domino it all the way back so that no one owns land because that makes everyone worse off, right? Um, so that might be the case sometimes, right? Uh, even if everyone acquired all the good stuff, the right. So even if Z takes the last piece of land, um, person Z plus one uh, is still better off than if Z hadn't taken that land because there's going to be more produce around, right? Um, if someone acquires copper, right, but they use it to produce indoor plumbing, I'm still better off, right? I don't own any copper, but at least I can go to the store and now I can buy a pipe, right? And I can use a pipe. So something like that has to be made to work out, right? And Nozick thinks that it can be worked out, right? He doesn't, a lot of people can write on this. So Nozick is just doing enough to say that it's plausible that sort of step one of his three step process of justice in holdings and distribution can work out, right? The idea of original acquisition. He says it doesn't entail this infinite regress where no one can acquire anything, right? Sometimes everybody's made better off by some people owning stuff and doing something useful with it. So you'll need something like that lock proviso, though, right? So you do need to rule out cases where someone acquires the only water source in a desert and charges everyone outrageous prices. So sometimes that enough and as good left proviso should kick in, but it doesn't need to create the vicious regress. And it wouldn't even rule out, I mean, Nozick thinks it's perfectly fine to invent a new drug and charge outrageous prices for it, right? Uh, Other people weren't worse off, right? Before you invented it, there was no cure, right? So if you invented a cure, then you can charge whatever you want because you haven't made anyone worse off than they were before. And there might be in between cases, right? So he considers like, well, what if someone discovers a new mineral that cures a disease and then goes out and buys up all of that mineral, right? Well, at the beginning, no one's made worse off because no one knew that the mineral cured anything. Um, but as time passes, you might say it might have been likely that someone else would figure out the mineral cures disease. And so at that point, you're making people worse off, in which case it would be wrong for that person to hoard all of that mineral. So this sort of applies to maybe there should be a time limit on patents or something like that. But Nozick does think that this original acquisition idea of locks can be worked out in your labor with something. And with that, and along with the just transfer and holdings, right, you've got, according to Nozick, a pattern of just distribution. Again, everyone, a pattern is just if everyone is entitled to their holdings. What makes someone entitled to their holdings? Either they got it through original acquisition, right, according to the lock, by mixing their labor with it, or they got it from someone else justly, buying it, being gifted it, right? Um, and that's it, right? There's no extra stuff about like, right? Nozick doesn't think you can be too rich, right? Nozick doesn't says if you're, very poor, doesn't see a problem with that either, right? So this is sort of on, the libertarian-ish uh, side of views. So in the next couple lectures, we'll see some other views that are a bit more distribution, right? Redistribution of holdings.